In the case of the arrest and psychiatric detention of Pastor Kashkambayev in Kazakhstan, Christian churches protested. The Association of Religious Organizations of Kazakhstan, which includes about 600 churches, has often used its position and numbers to pressure the parliament to respect religious freedom. The changes in the Kazakh legislation over the past year and the pending draft amendments in Kyrgyzstan pose such a threat to such civic work. Not long ago, for example, Christian women ministering to hospice patients in Kazakhstan were given crippling fines for reading the Bible and sharing the New Testament with the dying in their hospice centers. The Kazakh police has raided Baptist and other church youth camps, accusing them of violating religious laws and intimidating the children who are in attendance. Churches that engage in similar activities live in fear of closure and prosecution. One church in Kazakhstan has already closed 5 rehabilitation centers. To conclude, the religious situation across the region is extremely poor and I would argue declining. Negative trends in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are particularly worrying, especially for religious minorities. Both society and state will suffer if the faith-based civic and humanitarian organizations that have worked there for the past 25 years are further restricted and ultimately shut down. Thank you.
Thank you. And before turning it over to General Counsel Brumley, just to note, the fact that he's last is not an indication that his is the least important presentation. It's actually an indication that it's the most important, whether it's at a congressional briefing, a congressional hearing, other events on these issues. The voice of individuals and groups that are being persecuted, whether it's for religious freedom or other human rights violations, is actually most important for us to hear. And I wanted to make sure that before we had our final question and answer period, that his was the last voice that you heard. General Counsel Brumley.
Thank you for those kind words, Mr. Hurd. And we want to thank the U.S. Health-Seeking Commission, Chairman Wicker, Co-Chairman Smith, and you particularly, Mr. Hurd, for hosting this briefing. It's been also very illuminating and encouraging to hear the words of Ambassador Kozak, Dr. Mark, and Dr. Collins. Their insightful comments confirm our own concerns about the situation of Jehovah's Witnesses in the OSCE region. There are over 8.5 million Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. Over 3 million live in the OSCE region. We enjoy religious freedom in 51 of the 57 participating states. The exceptions include Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and since last April, as we know, the Russian Federation. When domestic courts have failed to protect our fundamental rights, we have resorted to seeking relief from international tribunals. Since 1993, we've obtained 64 favorable rulings from the European Court of Human Rights and 11 favorable decisions from the UN Human Rights Committee. But Mr. Hurd, by far, the problems we're facing in the OSCE region by far have to do with Russia. So I'll be concentrating on Russia in my presentation. In 2006, the government amended its law on counteracting extremist activity. It removed incitement to violence as a component of what constitutes extremism. The UN Human Rights Committee, PACE, and the Venice Commission have all strongly criticized the amended law because it gives the Russian government carte blanche to prosecute anyone it deems to be out of step with its version of what is acceptable. So based on this law as it's been amended, the authorities concocted a 3-step process to miscategorize Jehovah's Witnesses as extremists and to use this as the foundation to strip us of our fundamental rights of speech, press, and religion. The first thing the government did was to criminalize our religious literature. It did this through bogus expert studies and then backed up by baseless court decisions. They even banned our website, jw.org. It's worthy to point out, gentlemen and gentleladies, that jw.org is available worldwide with the singular exception of Russia. Second, Russia criminalized local congregations who'd been using our literature even before it was declared extremist. once literature that we had formerly been using was on the extremist list, we removed it and stopped using it. But the authorities went so far as to plant banned literature in our places of worship so that they could later discover it and bring charges. And we have this on video. Then third, it criminalized our religious activity at our national offices and in our local places of worship. So since this amended law on extremism was enacted, Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia have been subjected to the following: searches of their homes, places of worship, loss of employment, having their bank accounts frozen, mistreatment of their children by school authorities, detentions, secret video surveillance of their homes, monitoring of their mail, and intimidation to abandon their faith. And this decade-long campaign culminated, as you've mentioned astutely, on April the 20th with the Supreme Court decision. The court ruled that the administrative center and all of the 395 local legal entities are guilty of carrying on extremist activity, and that their property should be confiscated and their activity terminated. Due to a risk of criminal prosecution, we have ceased using our places of worship and our national offices. Our branches in Europe, Canada, and here in the United States inform us that there is an escalation in the number of witnesses from Russia seeking asylum. We're tracking 3 developments with particular interest, and you've mentioned them. The first is the criminal prosecution of Dennis Christensen. He's a citizen of Denmark. If convicted, he faces 10 years imprisonment. He's been denied bail and held in pretrial detention since last May. And his offense, singularly, he was worshiping along with a local congregation. Secondly, we're giving close attention to the proceeding by the government to take possession of our national offices. And this is in complete disregard for the fact that our administrative center or our national offices are owned by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania, a US-based corporation, and that the national offices are worth millions. The government is nevertheless seeking to confiscate it. And third, whether an appellate court will confirm a decision by a lower court to declare our Bible, the New World Translation, to be extremist. The New World Translation is available in over 150 languages and has been printed over 20 million copies. The very same translation in Russia is deemed to be an extremist publication. For just having this in one's possession, one risks criminal prosecution. These relentless and coordinated efforts confirm that Russia is bent on a minimum of driving Jehovah's Witnesses underground. Now, that said, to date, we are not witnessing mass arrests of Jehovah's Witnesses, but as you brought out, Dr. Mark, there's 175,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. The government seems to be taking the position that someone can be one of Jehovah's Witnesses, but you have to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses and keep it to yourself. Anyone who in any way engages in any activity related to our worship risks criminal prosecution. So the government is saying, in essence, you can be one of Jehovah's Witnesses, but don't associate with other witnesses. Don't read your Bible or any of your literature. Don't gather for worship. And whatever you do, don't talk to anybody about your faith. So we thank the many governments and their agencies, such as the U.S. Helsinki Commission, for your diplomatic efforts and statements. When we were at the hearing earlier this year, the Supreme Court hearing, the strong presence of the diplomatic community sent a clear message to the Russian authorities that the international community is well aware of what Russia is doing, and they're not deceived either. They realize that these proceedings are nothing more than a thinly disguised effort to legitimize the government's goal of stripping us of our fundamental right to worship. And just very, very briefly, I'm going to just hit on the situation of Jehovah's Witnesses in Central Asia and in Azerbaijan. We mentioned that in Kazakhstan, we're caught between 2 camps within the government, one that seems to be leaning towards application of the rule of law and maintaining our legal status, and another component of government that is mimicking what's going on in Russia. We were banned in Tajikistan in 2007, and we continue to worship in secret. Uzbekistan is the second worst offender of our fundamental rights in the OSCE region. Just to give you a capsule, since last September 2016, There's been 185 police raids on religious meetings, 153 convictions for religious activities, 148 fines. By the way, these fines amount to 100 times the monthly minimum wage. They're not small. 7 witnesses were jailed for religious activity, and there have been 15 documented accounts of severe beatings by the police of men and women who are Jehovah's Witnesses. Witnesses are fined for even having a copy of the Bible in their home. With regard to Turkmenistan, we have the same situation. Baram Hemdimov, a 52-year-old witness, has begun serving a 4-year sentence that he began in March of 2015. And his only offense, again, was worshiping with fellow believers. There has been some small improvements in Azerbaijan, but although we number less than 2,000 witnesses in that country, we have 18 applications pending with the European Court of Human Rights, and we have filed 11 complaints with the CCPR. So in conclusion, we are gravely concerned about the welfare of our community in Russia. We're going to submit for the record a copy of my briefing and also a copy of a short video from Mr. or Professor Heiner Bielefeld. That's the former UN Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Religion or Belief, who commented on the state of religious freedom in Russia and gave particular emphasis to the situation Jehovah's Witnesses are facing in that land. His point was, or is, that as the space for one religion diminishes, civil society and religious freedom in general diminishes. Thank you once again for allowing us to comment on the situation of Jehovah's Witnesses in the OSCE region.
Thank you. So just a quick reminder about the Q&A. I'll ask each one of our panelists 2 questions. If you could hold your answers until I finish asking all of my questions, and then we'll eventually turn it over to the audience. So we'll start with Chairman Mark. Taking advantage of your recent trip to Uzbekistan, in sort of the full range of steps that they can and should take to improve their record when it comes to religious freedom, and in particular, let's assume for the sake of argument that they're redesignated as a CPC. What are the most important actions the government needs to take in order to change that designation and improve the situation for religious freedom in Uzbekistan? And then secondly, was there an acknowledgement when you were there from the authorities that their crackdown on religious freedom over the years might actually be undermining their efforts to counter terrorist groups and counter violent extremists? And then for Dr. Collins, going back to Kazakhstan for a moment, you've noted that prior to their 2011 religion law, at least in the region, they had one of the most permissive environments for religion and for religious freedom. Why the shift? Why the change? And then secondly, I was particularly intrigued at your comments that in your research of Christian groups in the region, they rarely band together in response to persecution. And I'm wondering what your best hypothesis is or evidence is about the why. And then General Counsel Brumley, you noted that this persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia has been unfolding over many years. Why do you think it is that they've sort of taken so long rather than just doing it immediately, rather than immediately banning you and taking the kind of measures and actions that you've outlined? And then secondly, this is not the first time that witnesses have been persecuted in Russia. It's not the first time they've been persecuted in some of these other countries that you've mentioned, as well as in other parts of the world. Historically, how have they responded to a situation like the one in which they find themselves now in Russia? How have they compensated? Has there been sort of a change of practice, etc.? So we'll start with you, Chairman Mark.
Well, thank you for the excellent questions and for the opportunity to talk more about the trip to Uzbekistan. I mean, I can't capture in a few minutes what we experienced in a week, but there are, the big items that it's interesting. They told us in a meeting with government officials and some others that they're working on a new religion law. Now that's worrying because an experience from other places. I mean, even Vietnam, this new religion law has been kind of dragging on for years. The drafting actually did take some American comments, and then the implementation is yet another year, and so on. But you got to worry what's going to be in that law. Now, of course, in principle, it's a good thing. Oh, there's a new religion law. They're going to revise. They're going to reform. And the new president does seem to be better than the last one, and so maybe will be helpful. So I would say that there's a giant question mark hanging over the thing that depends on what happens. And again, based on what we know so far in the general trend, not overly optimistic, but it's an opportunity. It's an opening. And I think with the right kind of pressure, we could see some improvements. What would some of those look like? Well, the biggest thing that hangs over everything about religious freedom in the country is registration. Nothing can happen without registration. The group can't have property, it can't have services, it can't have literature, everything starts with registration. And of course, as we said, registration is a problem because that's how the government starts its control and surveillance. Nobody wants to register. So we sat in front of government, and government officials said, nobody's applied for registration in 10 years to church. Well, why is that, right? Is it because Christians don't want to open churches? And it's not just Christians, by the way, because Christians don't want to open churches. No, it's because when they say registration involves providing us a list of 100 names and addresses of people affiliated with your church, everybody says, no, thank you. That's just giving them a list of people to pick on. And that's what they're going to do, and everybody knows this. And so, as I've been saying a lot post-trip, even insofar as the government does begin to implement reforms, they're going to have to work overtime to actually convince people that it's true and that they're sincere. And so reforming registration, I mean, we at USERF and in the human rights community in general probably would rather see just registration be done away with. You shouldn't have to register. But if you do have to register, there should be rule of law, there should be transparency, there should be protections, and so on. A second thing is education. I mean, to go to another part of the world, you travel a long way, and so maybe it feels like it should be that as different as it is, where children are not allowed to attend religious services. And 95+% of the country is Sunni. If you're under the age of 16 or 18, depending on the circumstances, you just can't go to weekly services at the mosque. You're just not allowed. Police will stand outside and keep children out. Government obviously controls all the education in the country, and the number of religious educational institutions are extremely limited. And the opportunities for religious education for children outside the home are almost non-existent. And so that needs to be, I mean, the most basic things that we take for granted here. And then the third thing that I'll say, and just giving you a big three that could go on, of course, a lot, is prisoners. Until we are convinced that there are not many thousands of people being held in prison for their innocent religious beliefs, then Uzbekistan will not have an easy time getting off the CPC list. Our policy analyst, Andrew Kornbluth, who is with us on the trip, God bless him, he's sitting here too, was so diligent about asking at every opportunity, how many religious prisoners are there? How many have been released? Can you give us the name of one person who was in prison for his religious beliefs and now has been, and that they basically ignored us. And so until they want to get serious, at least about, even one of laughable said, oh, well, all the information's publicly available. Well, we can't find it. So, so until they get serious about that, they're just not going to be normal place. On the second is the crackdown undermining CVE, the efforts to counter violent extremism. Well, sure. I mean, it was something else. I'll just say that the first or second day we were there was the day that the Uzbek terrorist perpetrated his attack in New York City, and that certainly gave a certain color to our trip. And well, where does that come from? How does that happen? I mean, even if that person was radicalized outside of Uzbekistan, well, why was that person susceptible to the radicalization? We know that the crackdown drives movements underground, which is counterproductive. We know that the lack of education, proper religious education, leaves people susceptible to more radical and violent views. And even, I mean, we heard an amazing story from a prison. He had just been out 3 weeks out of prison after what was maybe an 11-year sentence. And he was just out sitting with us in a coffee shop. And he said, people come to prison, and this is the story from Shawshank Redemption, where you have to go to prison to become a criminal. He said that people who are too Muslim for the government's liking get sent to prison. Having been sent to prison, they see not only that, their own abuse, but then the torture and other abuse of people, and say, this is all being done in the name of the newfound Uzbek independence, in the name of the newfound Uzbek democracy. If this is what's being done in the name of Uzbek democracy, we want no part of it. And so they come out of prison more radicalized than when they went in. Now, that's not everyone, but it was such a striking example of the way the persecution exacerbates the problems they have and is counterproductive for their totally legitimate efforts to fight radical Islam. It's a pretext in the first case, and then an exacerbation of their own problem in the second case. And so certainly it is our line that all around the world, countries that truly want to commit themselves to countering violent extremism have to also commit themselves to religious freedom.
Before turning over to Dr. Collins, I just want to commend the project Under Caesar's Sword, where she is a scholar, not just as something interesting and important of itself, but also as a model. There are many groups and institutions that document the persecution of religious groups. What makes Under Caesar's Sword different is that it primarily focuses on how particular communities are responding to the persecution itself. And it's certainly a model that I think can and should be replicated in looking at how other religious groups are responding to persecution. Dr. Collins.
Thank you very much. And I would actually point you to Notre Dame's website, where there's extensive information about how different Christian communities are responding to persecution around the world. The focus is not just on Central Asia or Russia, but in many areas of the world where the situation is sadly even more egregious than what we're talking about right now. On your first question, Mr. Hurd, why the shift in 2011? Well, I think there has been a sort of gradual move towards this across the region, but in particular, I think a couple of events triggered the Kozak government's crackdown on religious groups. There was the Kyrgyz Revolution, regime change in 2010, which created this sort of sense of vulnerability and instability in the region. The Arab Spring in 2011, perhaps even more so, created this sense that we're not quite invincible. In Azerbaijan, for example, there was a statue of Mubarak and Aliyev, which at the time of the revolution was something that gave the Aliyev regime some pause. Not just Kazakhstan, but again, Kazakhstan in collaboration with Russia and other members of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, discuss these issues on a regular basis. They they blend together issues of religious independence together with issues of extremism and terrorism within the framework of their general sort of security discussions and focus on security. So I think these various events help sort of shift their thinking towards a mentality that we need to crack down on religion to a greater extent than we have in the past. There's also this understanding that even though Christians aren't the main target, we have to engage in this kind of equal opportunity repression. We're primarily worried about independent Muslim opposition growing in the country, but they decide that in order to justify and legitimize their crackdown on independent Islam, they need to more broadly crack down on various forms of independent religion. So I think that's driving much of this. And then we see, of course, that the escalation there has been an escalation of the actual implementation of these regulations post about 2014, when the growth of ISIS has made them more conscious of the security threat to the region. But again, it's this crackdown on both Christians as Muslims, as Christians and Jehovah Witnesses are rolled into the crackdown on supposed supporters of ISIS. So that's on the issue of why this shift over the past few years. The second question about why Christians rarely band together is an interesting one and a frustrating one. I think as somebody studying this region, why don't they engage in greater collaboration? And the few instances where they have collaborated, as I mentioned with the case of with the example of the ARC in Kazakhstan, with the protests about Pastor Kashkumbayev, have sometimes garnered some success. This has been relatively rare. My sense is that there are a couple of reasons for this. Probably most importantly is a deep culture of distrust, of sharing information, opening up to others, even opening up to other Christian organizations. And I think that dates well back to the Soviet period, as Dr. Mark talked about so eloquently. Many of these groups have been around despite being labeled by the governments as new groups or new Christians. Many of them have been around since before the Soviet period. They endured repression under the Russian Tsarist regime. They endured serious repression under the Soviet era. When there was liberalization finally for the Russian Orthodox, they have still continued to endure repression. So there's this sense of distrust of each other, not knowing who might be an informer. And that has undercut opportunities to work across different church lines. Together with that, there is a distrust of foreign groups or groups that have, churches that have foreign and missionary ties internationally. So local groups have a sense of skepticism about the commitment of many internationally based or foreign religious groups and missionaries that have come into the countries in recent years. And I think this culture of distrust hasn't broken down yet. They also differ in their ideas about strategies, how to deal with the current situation. Many of those that have been in the region the longest and endured the Soviet repression would prefer to sort of stay underground, continue to hide, continue to worship in their house churches, whereas some of the newer groups, or some of the groups that have more international connections, have moved more towards these open charitable opportunities and working with local level governments. I do think that greater opportunity for collaboration and discussion of these strategies, which is something that the Under Caesar Sword Project hopes to facilitate, would help them to realize that by adopting some of the more successful strategies, such as engaging with local government and collaborating in social work, is something that might advance their cause and their religious freedom over the longer term. So I think those are probably some of the major reasons. The last thing I would note is that both the governments in the region, as well as civil society actors in general, have undercut some of these efforts. Civil society, surprisingly, perhaps because it is so deeply secular across much of the Central Asian former Soviet regions. They tend to distrust religious actors. So there's not a tradition of secular civil society working with religious actors and considering them also part of the religious and also part of the civic sphere. And then the government, I think, to some extent plays the same role with religious organizations that it does with political opposition, attempting to sort of plant distrust and fear within that community to undercut any sort of collaborative efforts. Thank you.
General Counsel Brumman.
Thank you. Your first question had to do with why is Russia proceeding the way it has and taking so long in its relentless pursuit or attack on Jehovah's Witnesses. Essentially, to give a veneer of giving Jehovah's Witnesses due process of law. That would be my answer. The concept is we were registered. Again, we gained legal status in 1992. Almost immediately, the General Prosecutor Office in Moscow began proceedings against the Moscow congregation. They instituted 5 different cases. They lost all 5. The 6th one, they won. That went all the way up to the Supreme Court in Russia. We appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. In 2010, the European Court handed down its decision, Jehovah's Witnesses of Moscow and Others versus Russia. It's a wonderfully written decision. It meticulously goes through the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses and whether any of these beliefs or practices pose any threat to the Russian people. And the decision categorically rebuts every single argument raised. Now, an objective reader of that decision would have said, okay, case closed, Jehovah's Witnesses are no threat, we can leave them alone. But even before the decision was handed down, Russia had already amended its laws, such as the law on counteracting religious extremism, essentially to look for a new way of attacking Jehovah's Witnesses. If Plan A didn't work, then we'll go to Plan B. So it was illuminating earlier this year in April at the hearing before the Supreme Court, as the lawyers for Jehovah's Witnesses would raise procedural objections that were very cogently raised. The prosecutor would stand up and literally say 2 or 3 sentences. And the judge would look at the prosecutor, look at the lawyers for the witnesses, saying, having heard from the defendants and having heard from the general prosecutor, I concur with the general prosecutor. To give you 2 quick examples. In one motion, the attorneys representing Jehovah's Witnesses said, you know, you are threatening to criminalize 395 local religious organizations. They have a right to be here in court if you're going to criminalize them. And the prosecutor stood up and said, they all make the same arguments. So when we hear from 1 or 2, we've heard from all of them. And the judge says, yes, you're right. And so they don't need to be here. Well, the second motion, or a different motion that was raised was, as local religious organizations were being criminalized, the Administrative Center affirmatively sought to intervene in the case. The judges in each case said, no, you're not a defendant, you're not concerned or a party to this. The Administrative Center then said, why should evidence adduced at those hearings now be introduced against us when we did not even have the opportunity to defend ourselves? And again, the judge listened to the prosecutor say essentially 2 or 3 sentences and overruled the motion. So, Mr. Hunt, there's an effort to create a veneer of due process of law, that Jehovah's Witnesses have had their day in court, where really the determination is a foregone conclusion. Essentially, we're thinking as well that Russia is hoping that no one will notice. So the fact that the international community was present at the trial and at the Supreme Court, and the fact that human rights organizations are talking about this is helpful. It shows that what Russia is doing is not going to happen unnoticed. Your second question is quite interesting as well, Mr. Hunt, about this isn't the first time. It's interesting, in this decision of 2010 from the European Court, it brought out that Jehovah's Witnesses have been present in Russia since 1891. We were banned under communism, under the Soviet regime, gained our legal status again in 1992. So we're not an unknown community within Russia. In fact, many Russians are 4th, 5th, even 6th generation Jehovah's Witnesses. What did we do when we were under ban during the Soviet era? It's the same principles we apply now and that we've applied where this situation unfortunately presents itself anywhere in the world. In the Apostle Paul's first letter to Timothy, he said something that we follow, that we pray concerning kings and all those in high positions, that we may go on leading a calm and quiet life with complete godly devotion and seriousness. The point there is that Jehovah's Witnesses just seek to worship in peace. As Mr. Bielefeld said, we are the most peaceful people in the world, in that we are doctrinally opposed to violence. So the farthest thing from extremism. So our effort is to peacefully worship. But then when a government says, no, you can't peacefully worship, and we go back to what the apostles said, we must obey God as ruler rather than men. So regardless of whatever steps Russia takes, Jehovah's Witnesses are not going to disappear. We will continue worshiping and continue doing what we have done. History bears out that we actually grow when persecuted, sometimes faster than where we have legal status. So the efforts by the government to dissuade us from worshiping aren't going to stop us from doing so, as that's what history bears out.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we have any questions from the audience. Yes, if you wouldn't mind using my microphone, please.
Thank you, Nate, for organizing great and informative hearing. I wanted to call quick attention to two aspects which haven't been discussed. Well, they have been discussed, but I'd like to raise some new aspects. One is the new minister in Kazakhstan of religion and civil society was recently told is a 25-year veteran of the Kazakh state security services. Some of you obviously know this, but I just think it's worth highlighting publicly. Also, in Uzbekistan, I was told that the government is taking steps to assess the degree to which various religious prisoners, I suppose mainly Muslim, have been in fact radicalized in prison. However, this is a highly corrupt process. In addition, of course, to very dubious criteria, I assume they will be using. So perhaps it would be useful to call on the Uzbek government to follow international, good principles that have been followed in other countries. And finally, also on corruption, I have been told by a Kyrgyz lawyer that there's widespread corruption in southern Kyrgyzstan, especially vis-a-vis the large Uzbek minority, that if Uzbeks want to avoid being arrested on arbitrary charges of being religious extremists, you have to pay bribes. And there are some 200 people, this is as of several years ago, who are currently too poor to pay bribes and hence in prison.
She didn't identify herself, so I will. No, it's fine. Kathy Cosman is a longtime staffer at USERF and one of the world's leading experts on religious freedom, in particular in Central Asia and Russia, as you can tell from the granularity of your question. Thank you. Yeah, please. If any of the panelists should feel free to answer.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. That's also the information that I have about the director of the new ministry. Again, hearkening back to Soviet-era policies, creating a ministry which allegedly is about religion and civil society. In fact, appears by all accounts, starting with its leadership, to be actually about monitoring religion and undercutting its independence. So yes, I would agree with that. On the other point about the role of corruption, it's interesting because I think it cuts both ways. On the one hand, in Kyrgyzstan, the prevalence of corruption in the police force is something that has, in part, I think, accounts for the fact that there are fewer religious prisoners in Kyrgyzstan over the past few years, because people tend to bribe their way out. Rather than being readily imprisoned, they can bribe the police to pay lower fines or to avoid being in prison. But as you point out, right, that of course means that those who can't afford to pay the bribes are the ones who do, in fact, end up in prison on various charges. Yeah.
I apologize. I have a plane to catch. I'm already cutting it pretty close. I didn't even get to plug our annual report yet, but I've got to excuse myself. But thank you, everyone, for being here, and I know you'll continue to learn a lot from the others.
Are there any other questions from the audience? And do we have any questions from our viewers on Facebook? Well, again, I'm grateful to all of you who are here in person, to those of you that are watching online, for being here on a winter day, and in particular to our panelists for, I think it was a very rich, important, and engaging discussion. I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists. Actually, before we do that, I do want to thank both the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, Senator Wicker, co-chairman Smith, for their support for this hearing and religious freedom more broadly, as well as to my colleagues, Stacy, Jordan, and Lydia, who were instrumental in organizing this. So please join me in thanking the panelists.
You're the one that made the decision to leave Jehovah's Witnesses when you were baptized by somebody else outside of Jehovah's organization.
And you've also clearly demonstrated that your beliefs are not in complete alignment with the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, Jehovah's Witnesses' beliefs aren't in complete alignment with Jehovah's Witnesses because they constantly change.
But that's up to us to accept that
But
And
God's
we
word
unite.
doesn't change. The Bible doesn't change.
We trust in the faithful and discreet slave. And when the light gets brighter and we have better understanding, then we'll accept those new.
Do you know that's a really interesting scripture, Proverbs, what is it, 4:18? Because it's used a lot. Is it Proverbs 4:18? I'm going by memory. I mean, starting in verse 14 for context. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil men. Shun it, do not take it, turn away from it, and pass it by. For they cannot sleep unless they do what is bad. They are robbed of sleep unless they cause someone's downfall. They feed themselves with the bread of wickedness, and they drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous is like the bright morning light that grows brighter and brighter until full daylight. The way of the wicked is like the darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. This is not about new understanding. It's about contrasting the path of a righteous person versus the way of the wicked, light versus darkness. I mean, it's very clear by the context.
And I can attest to it from my personal experience.
Yeah.
That when I left what's out there, the path did get great. I mean, what the wisdom and the knowledge that Jehovah's Witnesses have compared to anything else out there is it's like a bright path. I agree. And
well, that's your testimony, and I would never ever challenge you on that. That is your testimony.
But just like it was my choice to
As
leave,
an adult. There's a big difference. I mean, Jesus was 30 when he was baptized, and he was perfect.
I can tell you, you were decades more wise than I was at 30 than you were at 15. Decades ahead of me. In Bible knowledge and spirituality. I'll take any 8-year-old here that had more wisdom and knowledge of the Bible than I did when I was 30. It's just starting to study.
No, there are good study practices.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I agree.
And so I would argue that they could make a better decision on whether or not they want to serve God than I could at 30. But in any case, I chose to come into this organization because I liked the light.
I didn't. I was born into it.
And so you can choose not to be a part of it.
Without being ostracized and shunned by everybody I love. That's actually a human. That's actually the disfellowshipping arrangement. So I'm glad you brought that up because it relates to human rights. One of the things we are all proud of that Watchtower has done is they have taken cases to the Supreme Court and fought for. No, I want to make a valid point.
But first, you're not disfellowshipped.
I haven't disassociated myself.
Yes,
and the show me in a publication where getting baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is an act of disassociation. I appeal to the governing body to show me that that is an act of disassociation, because by you saying that that is an act of disassociation, you are actually disagreeing with God's word, which tells us that is how to be baptized. A body of water in the name of the Son, Father, and Holy Spirit.
Outside of the organization.
I did it in Lake Michigan.
And
did you do it by yourself?
No, I did it with a fellow believer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, outside of God's organization.
Someone.
Matthew 24, 45 through 47.
Can I just say something really quick about human rights, because we were talking about like consequences?
I just don't want to hear about that right now.
Okay, about human rights?
The human rights of this world. We're talking about Jehovah's organization.
Well, Jehovah's organization cares about human rights.
Matthew 24 and 45 through 47. It says there, who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them their food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings. Now we as Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the organization that we follow from the state of New York is in fulfillment of this scripture. You feel otherwise.
No, I don't. No, I don't. No, I'm telling you, I don't. I believe in faithful and discreet slave servants.
In a faithful and discreet, yeah, but you don't believe that the Watchtower Society is it.
They didn't believe that they were it up until 2012. And so this was not their semantics. I'm telling you, Watchtower history, which you should really care about because you put your faith in it.
We do.
They did not teach that they were the faithful and discreet slave as like a group of 7 or 8 men, maybe 9, maybe 10, we don't know how many it will be, or less, until 2012, and then they put it in publications in 2013. Prior to that, the faithful and discreet slave were all of the anointed remnant on earth, and that's who the faithful and discreet slave were when I was baptized in 1994, and I absolutely agree with that. And I even agree because, again, I am not the judge. I've never even had like a in-depth, I've met a few of them, but like a personal face-to-face conversation with these people to judge whether they are faithful and discreet. So I can go along with that. That's fine.
And I'm sure many of the 3 million that crossed the Red Sea probably never even spent time with Moses.
No, but his face was glowing and he was performing miracles.
He was the representative.
Absolutely.
And it's the same true today. Jehovah has a representative on earth. It's not Moses, but in this case it's men.
The faithful and discreet slaves. Yeah, I agree. I agree.
I'm not sure, do we have anything else we want to discuss? I think that's all we have.
Well, I appeal your decision, and if you announce me as...
I want to clarify this. This is not our decision.
So then you don't have anything to announce. If it's not your decision...
You disassociated yourself with Jehovah's Witnesses, so the announcement will be made that on Thursday that you are no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, if you do that, I will be... I've been in communication with a lawyer, and there will... Wow. Is this what you call shepherding?
This is not a shepherding call.
What was it?
It was just to let you know of your decision to dissociate yourself.
This is how the Pharisees treated people in Jesus' day. And I just pray that our Father forgives you because right now you don't know what you're doing. People kill themselves because of things like this when they are shunned. I won't because I live by grace now and the love of Jesus Christ, but I think, like, do you even care? You knew Ricky. He's dead. He's dead because he couldn't handle being shunned. Do you know how many people who are survivors of child sex abuse I'm in contact with who have PTSD because of how they've been treated by elders? Does that matter to you? Does that matter to you? Does it make your heart sad for them?
But we also want you to know that if you ever have any change of heart or thinking, feel free to contact any one of us. We'd love to talk to you.
Change of heart. What would a change of heart even look like? I've already told you that the Bible is my authority and that Jesus Christ is my Lord. So what sort of change of heart am I supposed to have? And I looked Steve Knowles in the face.
You've already made clear it's a different interpretation.
Right. And
Scott, I really like you, and I'm just sad to see you following men. It's called idolatry. It makes my heart sad.
Yes, because I worship Steve Knowles.
No, because this organization is being taught to follow men in New York. They were part of the United Nations for 10 years.
I understand.
That's sad.
I understand.
I don't think you do.